Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Rona-Tas, past president of SASE. I will introduce the talk. The lecture will be recorded and shared later. This is our 32nd annual conference, and this year's theme is Development Today, Accumulation, Surveillance, and Redistribution, chosen by our president, Nitsan Chorev. Nitsan is the Harmon Family Professor of Sociology and International and Public Affairs at Brown University. She's the author of 3 books, co-edited a 4th, and published dozens of articles in top journals, including the American Sociological Review and Review of International Political Economy and Theory and Society. In her latest book, Give and Take, Developmental Foreign Aid and the Pharmaceutical Industry in East Africa, published this year by Princeton University Press, she argues that foreign aid done right can help less developed countries. Her detailed historical comparative study of the pharmaceutical industry in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda since the 1980s demonstrates that foreign donors can make a positive difference by helping establish markets, monitor performance and quality, and mentor local producers with know-how and technology. What her book shows convincingly is that markets are not the natural movement of economic activities, but a delicate ballet requiring choreography, coaching, and practice. When last year, the members of SASE elected Nitsan as president, the conference theme was the unpredictability of the future. Still, that we would have our next meeting fully online because of a pandemic was completely unfathomable. But here we are, and in many ways, Nitsan's work at the intersection of politics, economics, and global health is such a good fit to the current crisis that it almost looks like we had a crystal ball. Well, we didn't. Last year, many of us, including myself in my presidential address, were fretting about surveillance and technology overturning our lives. No one anticipated that just a year later, our hopes to return to our normal existence will be pinned on the most intrusive forms of surveillance, like mandatory testing and contact tracing. This is what Nitsan's talk, I anticipate, will address, but she might surprise us. Thank you.
Thank you, Akosh, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming for this talk and for the SASE conference, the SASE virtual conference this year. The title of my talk is The Virus and the Vessel, or How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Surveillance. Don't touch your face, wash your hands for 20 seconds, keep 2 meters away from others. SARS-CoV-2 was first identified in December 2019. The virus has been responsible so far for making 14 million people sick and for the death of almost 600,000 individuals. In response to the virus, certain behavioral modifications were called for, and selected practices of social control were employed. We've been there before. Viruses, bacteria, and parasites have long impacted our social order. Leprosy, according to Michel Foucault, gave rise to rituals of exclusion that provided the model for a pure community. The mosquito brought not only malaria to Egypt, it brought modernity. With the mosquito's help, Timothy Mitchell wrote, questions of hygiene, disease, housing, and ignorance emerged as the principal way of addressing the situation. In turn, social orders produce diseases. For James Scott, diseases are the mocking manifestation of failed state control. Others have suggested that nature's current breakdown is nothing less than a revolt against capitalist imperatives. Given our preoccupation with taming and exploiting nature, we may question the supposed yielding of a social order to nature's commands. Norbert Elias insisted that it was shame, not hygiene, that made people change how they handle bodily fluids. Maybe so. But turning Elias on his head, Foucault has beautifully shown how, normalizing gaze aside, society has been made through disease. In passages that may strike us today as eerily familiar, Foucault describes the measures taken when the plague appeared in a town. He concludes, I quote, "This enclosed segmented space, observed at every point, in which the slightest movements are supervised, in which all events are recorded, in which each individual is constantly located, examined, and distributed among the living beings, the sick, and the dead. All this," he says, "constitutes a compact model of the disciplinary mechanism." The response to COVID-19 similarly constitutes a compact model of social control. In this talk, I will try to convince you that this compact model produces not a familiar disciplinary order, but a different one. In the first part of the talk, I look at how states see their subjects and argue that COVID-19 reveals and normalizes a state's view of subjects as unresponsive and therefore ungovernable. In the second part of the talk, I look at how social media companies help constitute us as ungovernable. Finally, I discuss how today's resistance, including Black Lives Matter, might save our democratic political agency after all. The coronavirus does not impact all communities in the same way. COVID-19 took hold in the more globalized countries and in the global north before it began to spread in low and middle income countries in the global south. In many countries, the virus disproportionately affects communities of color. This is important because it makes COVID-19 an economic and political story of inequality and death. It reminds us that vulnerability to the virus depends on measures governments take or don't take in response to the disease. It also reminds us that vulnerability to the virus depends on measures governments have adopted long before the virus showed up. Measures that affect healthcare, education, employment, and policing. What kind of measures then did governments take in response to the disease? How did they enforce social distancing, for example? By recommending subjects to sit afar from each other, mark 6 feet clearly on the floor, close stores and restaurants? Differences in government measures tell us how governments see the virus. They also tell us how governments see their citizens. Social theorists have considered the various ways the state watches us and explained what the state tries to see. Subjects are seen for the purpose of tax collection, military conscription, and political stability. They are watched for the sake of economic development and population control. We are seen through censuses in police stations and hospitals, via SATs and CCTVs. The state knows our names, our income, who we vote for, how well we take care of our kids. But the state doesn't simply know who we are. The state uses that knowledge to make us, turn us into loyal citizens, reliable workers, and good mothers. What we sometimes forget is that what the state knows doesn't emerge only out of watching. Instead, the state holds preconceived perceptions regarding what we are and sees us through these perceptions. The state sees us through the lens of what it expects to find. This means that it is what the state thinks it knows as much as what it actually observes that informs how the state makes us. Theories of power normally focus on the practices of control that constitute us as subjects. Instead, here I'm interested in the state's view of its subjects, which informs these practices in the first place. It is the state's view of its subjects, as much as the practices that follow that view, that shapes the constitution of citizens as active or inactive subjects, and thereby our political future. To ascertain the likely effectiveness of a policy, a state evaluates how likely it is for citizens to respond to it, and for that purpose, it employs a certain theory of action. The response to COVID-19 has exposed in this way how a state sees its subjects. The response to COVID-19 also exposed meaningful variation in government responses. Governmental measures that see and constitute agents as capable of choice and action have been used widely, but only Sweden relied on such measures as its primary response. Nudging, which relies on a view of subject as only minimally capable, is also widespread, but was emphasized in England in particular. Digital surveillance, which sees agents as ungovernable, was a central part of the response only in a few countries, including Israel. Still, I will argue that the view of the subject as inactive is becoming the dominant view of citizens today. Sweden's approach to the pandemic has been considered exceptionally lenient. The Swedish government forbade large gatherings, but it did not close restaurants, bars, or cafes. The government recommended universities to switch to remote learning, but kept elementary schools open. People with mild symptoms were asked, rather than instructed, to stay at home. Instead of bans and prohibitions, the Swedish government made recommendations. The response to COVID-19 was to be a matter of self-regulation. Citizens were asked to use the judgment, take individual responsibility not to spread the disease, and do the things they think would fit them the best. In truth, this self-regulation was in effect what scholars call control at a distance. The state didn't exactly trust people to act responsibly. Experts from the Swedish Public Health Agency told subject what was the responsible, mutually respectful behavior to follow, and the state trusted people to act according to what these experts say. One state official suggested that the only difference between the Swedish approach and that of other countries was the tone. I quote, "Instead of telling people what to do, we are trying to explain." What matters for me here is what this approach tells us about how the government sees its subjects. What kind of agency does the government assume? Following insights from the literature of governmentality, it is easy to see that trusting citizens' self-regulation, which is nevertheless aligned with expert recommendations and state interests, relies on a view of active citizens who have the necessary faculties and the will to make choices, and who have the discipline to act according to those choices. In short, it relies on a view of citizens who are capable of choice and action. In England as well, the government initially avoided restrictive rules. To achieve herd immunity, the government did not impose a national lockdown. It even allowed soccer matches and horse racing festivals. But rather than relying on citizens' self-regulation, the government employed behavioral tricks advocated by the government nudge unit. One of the basic insights of nudge theory is that people could be made responsible for their action through gentle encouragement rather than coercion. This insight informs the placement of hand sanitizers in buildings and the clear markings of 6 feet on floors. Memorable rules are another form of nudging, which explains the recommendation to sing Happy Birthday twice while washing hands. To help people avoid touching their face, the nudge unit in England suggested the use of substitute behaviors, such as rub your face with the back of your arm, the use of physical barriers, hold your hands together, or the use of alternative behaviors, for example, drum your fingers on legs instead. What again matters here is what nudging tells us about how the state perceives its subjects. In sharp contrast to Sweden, England might have some faith in citizens' choices, but no faith in citizens' capability of action. The view is that of imperfect citizens who may want to make the right choices, but need help doing so. Nudges try to compensate for our weaknesses exactly by displaying choices in a way that frees individuals from the anxiety of choosing and from the challenges of acting. Note that with nudging, in the name of making action easier, behavioral manipulation is achieved by the government making the choices for us. Cass Sunstein, in The Ethics of Influence, assures us that the ethical problem of violating our autonomy, and I would add, undermining our agency, is, I quote, likely to be diminished if government is requiring people to do what they would do if they were properly informed. But he also emphasizes the importance of transparency and accountability. Other countries employed governmental measures and nudging techniques, but this was secondary to lockdowns and other coercive measures. The Israeli case reveals the limits of thinking of these coercive measures as merely disciplinary. Like Sweden and England, the Israeli response is unique. Still, the techniques used by the Israeli government offer us a view into the compact model of power, also elsewhere, and a view into a future in which we all learn to stop worrying and love surveillance. What stands out in the Israeli response is the use of digital, non-voluntary mass contact tracing. Contact tracing procedures are used to identify people who have come into contact with an infected person so that they know to self-isolate. Contact tracing is traditionally done by epidemiological field workers who use interviews to map out the movements and meetings of individuals who have tested positive. Tracers find out when those diagnosed with COVID-19 saw friends, went grocery shopping, etc., and in this way identify those who were exposed. But the need for us to remember when exactly we went grocery shopping is laughingly anachronistic. For those of us with mobile phones, applications that provide maps, calendars, and financial records do the remembering for us. Our phones know better than we remember. Other people's phones know things that we don't, including who was in the store with us. So why ask people to report on what their phones easily reveal? One reason that Israel was ahead of the digital contact tracing game is that in Israel, the virus confronted what officials at the Israeli security agency, the Shabak, nicknamed the vessel. This vessel contains personal information of all cell phone users, which is regularly collected by phone companies and that by Israeli law is shared with the Shabak. The vessel is a mass surveillance tool, and it involves, the vessel is a mass surveillance tool, and it involves indiscriminate surveillance of everyone. And the vessel is incredibly intrusive. It collects geolocation, information on phone calls and text messages, and information on websites visited. It also includes data collected from surveillance cameras, matched with facial recognition programs. With this data, it is remarkably easy and fast to trace the movement of those with COVID-19 and identify all those who had been near them. Even in Israel, there are strict procedures and rules that govern the use of the vessel. Another reason why Israel was ahead of this game is a parliamentary crisis in the wake of 3 inconclusive elections, which allowed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's caretaker government to approve emergency regulations that exposed the existence of the vessel to the Israeli public and allowed its use as part of the response to COVID-19. With the vessel, choice and action shift from citizens to an algorithmic device. A person identified as having had contact with a patient received a text message with information about their past whereabouts and an order to immediately self-isolate. Citizens had no way to contest the data. The vessel was also used to enforce self-isolation by geo-monitoring those who were told to stay home. In Stanley Kubrick's movie, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, a US attack is already underway when Americans learn about a Soviet doomsday machine, which is programmed to destroy the planet in response to any nuclear attack. When Peter Sellers, in the role of Dr. Strangelove, is told about the machine, he snaps at the Russian ambassador. He says, the whole point of the doomsday machine is lost if you keep it a secret. Following the same logic, let me clarify that the vessel, which until COVID-19 was a state secret, was not meant as a disciplinary mechanism, certainly not against the Israeli Jewish population. Rather, the vessel is designed to monitor and oppress the Palestinian population. It is used for collecting intelligence and as such should remain secret. Still, to the extent that Palestinians know that they are constantly monitored, the vessel, like any panopticon, functions as a tool of social control. And now that the entire Israeli population is aware of being constantly monitored, it has similar disciplinary implications. Indeed, Israel's response to COVID-19 included additional disciplinary and punitive measures. The government authorized prison sentences for violating isolation orders. It prohibited visitors, including lawyers, from prison and detention facilities, and it allowed the police to break up gatherings by the use of reasonable force. The measures have not been applied evenly. In my account so far, I failed to mention that measures in response to the coronavirus pandemic are often used discriminately, in accordance to the kind of agency attributed to different subjects. Governmental measures, like the ones emphasized in Sweden, are used for those assumed to respond to governmental rationality. Disciplinary measures are directed at those considered unresponsive. In New York City, for example, white residents who are trusted to govern themselves were offered face masks by police officers in Central Park, while people of color elsewhere in the city were beaten and arrested. In Israel, the expectation that Arab Israelis and Orthodox Jews would fail to keep social distancing led to tighter measures against them. This racialized inequality also explains why organizations concerned with the rights of the Arab minority in Israel were among those who challenged the use of the vessel in the Israeli High Court. Still, in response to COVID-19, disciplinary mechanisms expanded their scope beyond those who are normally targeted. To enforce self-quarantine, the Israeli police was present also in what one journalist naively called normally quiet neighborhoods. In spite of what I've just described, it would be a mistake to reduce the vessel to its disciplinary consequences. The vessel doesn't change its view of subjects just by shifting its gaze from Palestinians to Israeli Jews. Also, in its use for containing COVID-19, the vessel doesn't see subjects primarily as docile bodies that respond to correct training. A key for identifying the type of agency the vessel assumes is realizing that the use of the vessel for contact tracing, the collection and utilization of information, eliminates the need of subjects to make informed choices based on personal or civic sense of duty, and it eliminates the need of subjects to act in accordance with such choices. Action is only required at the later stage of self-isolation. The vessel strips subjects from any expectation for choice or action. While the Shabak's vessel contains an unimaginable amount of information about subjects, Israelis have been reduced to empty vessels themselves. And although Israel is alone in utilizing national intelligence tools in response to COVID-19, other governments use non-voluntary contact tracing apps which serve the same function. Many governments instead utilize voluntary contact tracing apps, but there is a mission creep in some cases. In India, a voluntary app later became mandatory for all public and private sector organizations. On a much smaller scale, it is likely that campuses in the US that open this fall would require students, staff, and faculty to use contact tracing apps. Governments want to see us, but what about the subjects? Have we learned to stop worrying and love surveillance? I think that yes, we too slowly learned to accept surveillance, if not as desirable, then as necessary or inevitable. It was only in 2013 that Edward Snowden shocked the American public by disclosing that phone companies regularly shared data with the NSA. When Israelis learned of the vessel, appeals against the tracking were made at the Israeli High Court, and experts in technology, privacy, and law called for privacy-preserving alternatives. On the whole, however, citizens responded with a shrug and memes on TikTok. In South Korea, where sweeping electronic surveillance was similarly used, I quote, public outrage has been nearly non-existent. In line with Naomi Klein's warning of a dystopian Green New Deal, others described, I quote, an uneasy tolerance of surveillance. Indeed, surveys suggest that people generally support surveillance measures. In one US survey, 45% thought it was acceptable for the government to use cell phones to track the location of people to manage COVID-19. In another, 60% were willing to install an app that would collect information about the location data and health status. In Switzerland, 72% were in favor of such an app. I want to suggest that the use of mass surveillance, whether mandatory or voluntary, for managing the coronavirus pandemic is a defining moment in our social order. September 11, 2001, an earlier defining moment, broadened the security apparatus and strengthened national security agencies, the police, and immigration agencies. As we know, securitization occurred not only in the US, but in many other countries as well. Today, in the name of global public health, COVID-19 allows the security apparatus to move from targeting those who allegedly cause risk to targeting those at risk, that is, everyone. Data is now used to protect us from others others from us, and us from ourselves. This shift, like the one before, is particularly noticeable in some countries, but it is spreading worldwide. But in addition to who is seen, we need to understand how we are seen. Both mass surveillance and nudging are based on a view of citizens as unreliable when it comes to choices and incapable when it comes to action. As such, citizens are seen as unresponsive to governmental and even disciplinary measures, and therefore ungovernable. If COVID-19 indeed becomes the defining moment of our time, it marks the rise of the ungovernable society. In such social order, the dominant practices of power are aimed not at training us or at convincing us to act at a certain way, but in bypassing the need to rely on our choices or actions altogether. And yet, when citizens are asked to voluntarily download tracking apps, they don't do it. In Israel, partly because the Shabak was not too happy with the civilian use of its treasured vessel, the Ministry of Health introduced a voluntary app for contact tracing called the Shield, which also metaphorically positioned itself beautifully as a contrast to a vessel. As of late June, only 10% of the Israeli population has been using the app. Downloading rates are low also in other countries, including Singapore, India, and Norway. With the exception of Iceland, no country reported a rate higher than 25%. And the rate seems independent of the privacy measures taken by the respective governments. Given people's principled support of mass contact tracing, I suggest that the low rate of downloads does not reflect objection to surveillance, but failure of governmentality. If the vigor of the vessel symbolizes the state's denial of subjects' capacity for choice and action, the impotence of the shield indicates that, when given a choice, subjects reject state's governmental practices. This should take us from how the state sees its subjects to ask how subjects see their state. I don't have time in this presentation for this detour, so I will just hint that due to a broken alliance between states, subjects, and experts, skepticism in many countries is on the rise. Skepticism should normally be encouraged. Skepticism is not always a reflection of critical thinking, however. The debate over Elon Musk's tweet that said, "Take the red pill," reveals the blurry line between distrusting experts and deeply misogynistic and racist positions. In the US, the embrace of the red pill by young people on the right occurred in online forums like Reddit and 4chan. They're not alone. Much of what we think we know about COVID-19, face masks, Wuhan, and herd immunity comes to us online. Today, we are seen by the state, but we are watched and constituted by social media companies as well. And these companies play an important role in how we have come to be seen as ungovernable. What kind of subjects are we imagined to be on social media platforms? What subjects are we becoming? Before I go back to COVID-19, let me briefly talk about tech companies more generally. Facebook, Google, Amazon, Netflix, but also the company that makes your digital thermometer, all employ extraordinary resources into seeing us. What we like, what we pay attention to and for how long, what we buy, and in what emotional state we do so. Companies then find ways to manipulate our preferences, choices, and actions. Shoshana Zuboff in Surveillance Capitalism describes in alarming detail how companies moved from monitoring to actuation, from behavioral prediction to behavioral manipulation. One way to get us to stay on a platform, even though we have more pressing things to do, or buy things we didn't know we wanted, is through nudging. Those little reinforcements and indirect suggestions that channel our decisions and actions. Nudging, combined with incomplete information, means that the same people who fail to download contact tracing apps still let weather apps know where they are, and wearable technologies know how fast we run. Crucially, nudging also manipulates our political behavior. Facebook found, for example, that it is possible to prompt people to vote by giving them the option to click on a button that says, "I voted." With similar techniques, in the last few months, Facebook nudged Americans to complete the 2020 census, donate to CDC, and register to vote. We should not in principle oppose the use of floor markings to encourage people to keep social distance. Similarly, we should not in principle oppose the use of social media to encourage people to vote. But at least when it comes to political behavior, I think that focusing on the outcome is a mistake because it may entice us to turn a blind eye if we find the end result agreeable. To the extent that Facebook can tilt elections by choosing where to deploy its I voted button, we may want to judge such action based on which party benefits from it. Instead, we should ask what kind of subject is seen and constituted through such tricks. As I mentioned earlier, behavioral manipulation through nudging relies on a view of subjects as only minimally capable of choice or action. With nudging, in the name of making action easier, behavioral manipulation is achieved by making the choices for us. With nudging, in the name of making action easier, we let unaccountable for-profit private companies decide for us what action to take. Our political behavior is further altered by manipulated information. Here, behavioral manipulation is achieved by diminishing our capabilities while still giving us the impression of choice and action. A major issue here is misinformation, including factually incorrect information, conspiracy theories, and so on. Another issue, which is as important but less well understood, is segregated information, which includes channeling certain information to some but not to others. This is done, as was the case with Cambridge Analytica, through micro-targeting, so that users only see political ads that fit their personality traits or, at minimum, the demographic category. But Cambridge Analytica merely mimicked practices that are used by social media companies themselves. Segregated information is applied to any feed ever circulated on a social media platform by algorithms that ensure that users mostly see posts that confirm what they already think. It is not only our homogeneous social circles or our confirmation biases, but the algorithm that creates echo chambers. Studies have shown that such echo chambers amplify racism and misogyny, as well as anti-vaccine and now anti-mask movements. Amartya Sen in Development as Freedom refers not to agency, but to free agency. Following Sen, we must understand that only capabilities that come with freedom allow people to lead the kind of lives they value and, as Sen has always insisted, have reason to value. Here, social media companies go beyond just having a view of our capabilities. Rather, they deliberately diminish our capabilities and limit the choices and actions that are available to us, to a point in which it is hard to still hold that our choices or actions are free. In this, social media companies make us ungovernable. Given the behavioral modification abilities exhibited by tech companies, as coronavirus became front page news, I've been waiting expectantly to see how Facebook, Google, and Twitter would turn these abilities into an asset in the service of global public health. But the response to COVID-19 was underwhelming. Google shared a nudging technique to help people wash their hands. Facebook unveiled a new care emoji. The magazine Wired summarized back in May, I quote, "So far at least, the pandemic response has become a bitter lesson in everything technology cannot do, and an example of Silicon Valley's legendary myopia." Later on, however, social media and other tech companies have become more active, initially not in governing the behavior of users, but surprisingly in disciplining the state. One intervention was in regard to contact tracing apps. After all, data collection and analysis are what these companies do for a living. Developing such apps could generate enormous profit. Fighting the spread of COVID-19 could repair companies' state reputations. And with such apps, even more user data could be collected. In Israel, the Minister of Defense initiated cooperation with NSO, an Israeli firm that had been accused of selling spyware technology to non-democratic governments. The US Department of Health and Human Services awarded a contract to Palantir Technologies, a secretive data mining firm that ICE, the US immigration agency, relies on to separate and deport migrant families. Past behavior suggests that these private companies would not be concerned with protecting our privacy. Most smartphones in the world are powered by Apple's iOS or Google's Android operating systems. In April, Google and Apple announced they were together designing a contact tracing app. For now, the commitment is for an app that is voluntary and privacy preserving, and the initiative has generated mostly positive commentary. If they maintain their original commitment, Apple and Google may have an app that, unlike either the Vessel or the Shield, keeps your data in your phone. If they maintain their original commitment, Apple and Google would make governments maintain greater data privacy and security than most governments intended. Another intervention in the course of COVID-19 is new steps taken to slow down misinformation. Most steps have been modest. Facebook, for example, directed users to the WHO website. When a video called Plandemic, which promoted conspiracy theories, went viral, Facebook and YouTube deleted the video, but only after millions of people had seen it. Twitter tagged as misleading and disputed some claims about the pandemic and blocked or removed other false claims, such as linking the disease with 5G wireless systems. Things got complicated when President Trump was the one spreading misinformation. In late April, Twitter decided that video clips of President Trump saying that scientists should investigate inserting disinfectant into COVID-19 patients did not violate the company's misinformation policy. A month later, however, Twitter for the first time flagged Trump's tweets that claimed that mail-in ballots would cause the presidential election to be rigged. Mark Zuckerberg kept his position that Facebook should not be what he calls the arbiter of truth. In the context of COVID-19, Apple and Google challenged governments to respect privacy considerations. Twitter is flagging misinformation circulated by elected officials. This suggests that social media companies are now willing to more effectively intervene in the way states see and govern subjects. It has minimal impact on how tech companies themselves see and govern. The response to the coronavirus pandemic reveals a compact model of power in which we are seen and constituted by both governments and tech companies as ungovernable subjects who are incapable of choice or action, and by extension, unsuitable for democratic practices. Public protest may change the way we see and the way we are seen. In May, Black Lives Matter protests erupted in response to the murder of George Floyd, in response to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, in response to a white woman threatening to call the police on an African-American man, but also in response to many similar accounts that were not caught on camera or circulated online. COVID-19 intensified other forms of violence against African-Americans as they were often a target of disciplinary measures, all at a time that COVID-19 in the US and elsewhere is disproportionately impacting communities of color. In hundreds of protests, Black Lives Matter activists demonstrate against police brutality and they call for social justice. Blacks claim the right to be seen as equal citizens. In mass protests all around the US and the world, signs challenge what the police see. Signs say, "My blackness is not a threat," and "the color of our skin is not a weapon." As importantly, African Americans demand not to be seen, not to be constantly monitored and watched. Disciplinary measures, as Foucault realized, apply not only to patients, but also doctors. Not only African Americans, but also the police officers who kill them. Police officers, however, have covered their badges in the protests. They don't always turn on their body cameras. And incredibly, information about disciplinary actions against police officers is not open to the public. Activists demand to see the police. How many weren't filmed was another sign seen in protests. While it is too early to assess the long-term political gains of the movement, public authorities and private companies might be responding to the pressure. The Minneapolis City Council approved the proposal to eliminate the city's police department. In New York, the police can no longer withhold disciplinary records from the public. IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft have posed sales to the police of their facial recognition products, which are biased and often misused. When Trump responded to the protests by tweeting, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," Twitter hid the tweet behind a warning label. Later, Twitter added a manipulated media warning to one of Trump's racist tweets. In response to a 1-month advertising boycott organized by the NAACP and other organizations, Facebook announced it would add warnings to posts from politicians that break its rules. And the response to the protests may lead to the disciplining not only of governments, but users as well. The advertising boycott is against all hate speech, not only government-sponsored. Reddit, the message board website where the red pill flourished, recently banned 2,000 communities, although most of them inactive, including the Donald, a hateful community of around 800,000 users devoted to Trump. Have we learned to stop worrying and love surveillance? In this talk, I argued that we should worry not only about the practice of surveillance, but also about the view of subjects that informs the use of surveillance and of nudging in the first place. I showed that COVID-19 revealed and normalized government practices that see us as unresponsive and therefore ungovernable. COVID-19 also showed us how social media companies diminish our capabilities as free political agents. With digital surveillance and nudges, we no longer need to make responsible decisions, and we no longer need to have the discipline to act based on those decisions. We are made to wash our hands for 20 seconds, self-isolate, put a mask on or not put a mask on, vote or not vote. And the more we are seen as ungovernable, the more difficult it becomes to govern us. As governments learned when they failed to convince us to keep social distancing, and the social media companies are learning as they are trying to curb misinformation. Because of echo chambers, we live in smaller, isolated worlds with logic, information sources, and belief structures of their own that need not be accounted for elsewhere. States and tech companies created the conditions for and exploit these echo chambers. But one could convincingly argue that governments and tech companies are quickly losing the ability to govern many of these spaces. Whether manipulated by governments or other entities, subjects are losing the ability to choose what they value or know what they have a reason to value. Citizens are losing their ability to function as democratic agents. It is left for citizens to fight back before we are all too compliant or too comfortable in our own bubble to even notice this loss of agency, before we all learn to stop worrying and love it all. Thank you.